Thank you for being here this evening. And I'm planning to talk about integrated pest management. A few people noticed something was different about that slide. Besides the pet that's on there, the picture came first and I typed that in, but really, uh-oh, worked before. Once you put it to Zoom, I think that stops the advance. Sorry, I thought I was advancing, but I think Zoom takes away your, is it taking it away for you too? Thank you. As Phil said, I was for 11 and a half years a state apiary inspector for 14 counties, including Chatham. And I have, I guess I'll be honest and say, over 30 years as a licensed RN in North Carolina. I still have that license. Got my basic education from University of Florida, who are now the basketball champions. But on to the main topic. Integrated pest management, and in particular, talking about varroa mites. First of all, so many people get tired of hearing about varroa. But the varroa don't get tired of beating up our bees. So we still have to deal with that. But it's a tough topic for a lot of beekeepers. And this program was one of the more difficult for me to put together because I want to have something for folks who are new to beekeeping and something for folks who have been keeping bees for some time and have more experience and a knowledge base. So I'll do the best I can to reach all of you, regardless of your level of knowledge and experience. The outline I want to follow is first say what is IPM, or Integrated Pest Management, talk about hygienic bees. When Pat asked me to do this program and we talked about IPM, she suggested that I focus on the element of hygienic bees, and I'll get into that shortly. That was one of the reasons that our county, and perhaps Chatham, was very interested in getting the microbreeder grant so that we could use some genetic influence on raising the queens that we want. Some of the ups and downs, ins and outs of using hygienics for your integrated pest management, and then final Q&A. Every so often, I will stop and ask if you have questions. So if you think of a question, please try to hold it because I get too easily distracted. And I may be coming up to your answer shortly anyway. Don't worry, you'll have time for questions. There are several different definitions that are given for integrated pest management, and I'm giving some of those that are most commonly seen. It's effective, it's environmentally sensitive, and it does get rid of the excess pests, relies on a combination of common sense practices. So you have a combination of efforts to make up integrated pest management, and it's got to be effective, it's got to be in tune with the environment and also with economics. Another definition tells of it as a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risks. And that latter definition is the one I see more often when it's applied to beekeeping. You can use integrated pest management for lots of different pests. Those of you who do gardening are familiar with that term. And there's ways to manage things like small hive beetles and all that, but because we seem to have so much trouble with varroa, that's what I'll focus on with this. Hannah Whitehead got her master's degree from Ohio State University, and in her thesis, which was entitled Varroa Mite Management Among Small-Scale Beekeepers, she says, unfortunately, there's largely been a failure by many beekeepers to adopt IPM principles in their varroa management programs, primarily due to gaps in knowledge and deficiencies in training. That was 8 years ago that was published, and I would suggest to you that that's still the case. I don't encounter that many people who, when they're talking about their varroa management, go right into IPM. And I would challenge you to any meeting you are among beekeepers, go up and ask somebody what their varroa management plan is. How do they deal with varroa? Probably the first or second thing they'll mention is whatever kind of chemicals they use. I'm not saying chemicals are a bad idea. I'm saying we have a tendency to jump to that first in our management. Sometimes people just find that they're all puzzled and not really sure they want to deal with in IPM. And then there's people that say, you know, I hear that it's all this so much to do, I ain't doing it. I don't want to, it's too much work, I don't have time, whatever. So while some of what I'll present to you might sound challenging, it's not as hard as what you might hear about. The resource page that I gave you, or gave to Phil, and I think he sent it to you, has lots of studies or commentaries, editorials about IPM and Varroa, explaining more in detail than what I'll have time to do tonight. But it gets pretty heavy into the science. So those of you who are kind of about science, you may or may not want to review all those. They're not all at the PhD level or anything like that. But if you're really interested in using genetics to further your Varroa management, I think you'll find those articles interesting. The first thing with IPM, as you may know, is identify the pests. If you don't know what a Varroa mite is or what it looks like, then you're going to struggle with the rest of IPM. Then you identify the threshold. And the thresholds have been identified by people who've done a lot of studies, research, and experience with Varroa to know how many Varroa are too many. We would love to say, well, I don't have a single Varroa mite in my beehive. And you can say that. Just set up an empty beehive and have it sitting there looking all pretty. There's not any way a Varroa mite can survive in that because they need a live host. So we're fortunate that people at the Honeybee Health Coalition work on these sort of things regularly and they update them regularly. This particular chart was in that until just a few years ago, and there's one part of it that's really no longer applicable because the thresholds are too high. I'll get to that in the next slide. But we can depend on people like Honeybee Health Coalition, some of those university professors and assistant professors and researchers who do a lot of research with Varroa can lead us to what the thresholds need to be. Because back when I started beekeeping a little over 25 years ago, there wasn't much talk about any kind of threshold. And then the first one I started hearing about was 10%. And if you let your threshold get to 10% nowadays of Varroa, you might as well just tell your bees goodbye. Monitoring regularly is a pretty important part of IPM. And so for us, we'll maybe use sugar shakes, maybe we'll use alcohol washes. I would suggest one of those two to really get some accuracy, or both of them. Explore your treatment options and then act. And Varroa Management Decision Tool gives us a wealth of information about how we can choose treatment options based on the information that we give to that tool. It's interactive, and it gives us answers based on what we put in there. So it's very individualized for your situation. It's not just cookie cutter, oh, you got Varroa, here's what you do. Although a lot of people would like that if it were that way. Don't forget to assess the results. A lot of people miss that step when they manage their Varroa. And when they get to the point where there's a chemical that's needed, even when they apply the chemical correctly, sometimes they don't go back to see how well that worked. And a lot of people have been messed up that way because they assumed, I used it, I followed the directions, everything seemed fine. And then their bees did not respond as well as they thought. So that's part of what enters into integrated pest management. The table that I pointed to in the last slide was updated on the Honeybee Health Coalition website. Right here, the second line says dormant without brood. And that would be late the fall, early winter, when there's not really any growth happening in the colony. They're moving around, but they're really not doing a lot, and they are then naturally broodless. The danger sign or threshold given for that is greater than 3%. And we know that that's not current anymore, because if you let it get to 3% during that time of year, you're probably not going to have living bees by March. So the Honeybee Health Coalition updated that, and they just have it into one dormant section, whether it's with or without brood. In the dormant phase, then they need action if it's greater than 1%. Now that may sound pretty low, and a lot of the thresholds do seem low, but there's method to that madness. Part of it is you can only capture a small percentage of the varroa that are in the whole colony, because when you're doing alcohol wash or a sugar shake, you're only able to get the varroa that are exposed, not inside a capped brood cell. And when you have brood in the colony, somewhere between 70 and 80% of those varroa mites are under a capped brood cell, so you can't access them. So that's one of the reasons that the thresholds are typically pretty low. They may change with time. So I want to suggest to you that, like other things with beekeeping, because they might change, try to keep up to date. That's part of what the state meetings are about. That's part of what beekeeping journals are about. Now, there is a significant factor in interpreting the thresholds that you don't really hear that much about. It's almost as though it were a secret, or people, I'm not sure why. I don't hear that much about it, but viral disease. If your threshold normally would be between 2 and 3%, and there are times on the Honeybee Health Coalition website that you can go to that level safely. But if you have something like that in your colony, anybody recognize anything wrong with that picture? Probably hard to see if you're kind of far back. This bee has terribly insufficient wings. She'll never be able to fly. And this bee here has just slivers for wings. So these are manifestations of deformed wing virus, a very common virus in a honeybee colony that's attributed to varroa mite presence. If there's enough of that virus in the colony, they will not survive. If it's late enough in the year, no matter what you do, they won't survive. So this is partly all about getting to your varroa management early enough that you can do something useful. We used to wait till August, maybe September, and things would usually turn out okay, even with the higher thresholds. But the varroa have gotten a lot tougher in the last 25 years. And so you can't wait until August to get started. I'll talk about when to go with varroa, and with IPM, and how to do it. This is another killer that is also often related, usually related to varroa. This is another viral disease. It's often known as parasitic mite syndrome. And the larvae that are slung to the side of the cell and sort of a dull white, that is never, ever a normal finding in a honeybee colony. So if that is also something that is going on when your threshold could be between 2 and 3%, you're going to have to lower your thresholds when there are viruses present, because the mites that are coming in are bringing in bad diseases. And with varroa mites, it's much more often the viruses that kill the colony than just the parasitization of the varroa, although both of them combine to knock a colony down pretty quickly, no matter how strong they were before the varroa load got too high. In beekeeping, this is specific to varroa. Some of you may have seen this kind of chart before. And there are several different pyramids that cover IPM, whether it's beekeeping or managing gardens or goats or whatever. So the specific one for beekeeping is similar to others, starts with cultural, and that's the foundation. And then you can use these other ones in combination. You don't have to wait until you've tried cultural methods and they totally failed and then you go to mechanical. It doesn't quite work that way. In fact, this is most effective when you use a combination. For example, under cultural, we see resistant stock. That's where your hygienics and your genetics come in. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then things like a brood break. We've heard that brood breaks help. Why is that? Why is a brood break helpful for varroa management? What do we know about varroa? They can only reproduce in the brood cells. And if you have no brood cells in your colony, that's a common natural phenomena for us in late December, early January, then the varroa mites cannot reproduce. I'm just hesitating because I get so thrown off if a question comes. That's okay, but now I'll answer because now I have to think about that. Viruses, we don't know where the original, it's sort of like, well, where did the original chicken pox come from? Where did the original herpes virus come from? So all we know is that the varroa mites tend to have these viruses, and we don't know what other creature the varroa may have gotten them from, except from their own relatives and inherited it in the cell. So you might use brood breaks, maybe include resistant stock. Maybe you're going to go with mite trapping, where you put these drone cell sized frames in there. They're often the fluorescent green if you buy them at bee suppliers. And that is sort of a magnet for varroa mites, because we still see that varroa prefer drone cells. So if you have these in the brood nest, the queen bee is laying in there, and then you've got a bunch of drone cells, then in theory and typically in practice, the varroa mites will migrate towards those frames. So you take them out and get rid of a lot of varroa mites that way. Screen bottom boards are still maybe, maybe not. I see people have screen bottom boards, but then they have the whole colony on a fairly solid table. So if there's not enough room for a varroa mite to fall through that screen, it will not help for varroa management. And even if there is a distance, the significance of how much screen bottom boards help varroa is somewhat limited. It can help, but it can't be your only tool if you want successful results. Powdered sugar works, and maybe it doesn't. There have been several studies that used powdered sugar, didn't really get very encouraging results. So you can't use that by itself either. So it doesn't mean you cannot and should not use any of these compounds, but notice they are higher up on the pyramid, which means that you're getting more and more into toxicity when you use more of those. And you're getting more into intervention rather than these prevention measures there. Varroa makes some people sad, makes some of us mad, and it also brings the Grim Reaper to many apiaries. I can't think of anything good to say about varroa mites, so I'll just go on with it. But I do want to point out the difference between varroa resistance and varroa tolerance. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they're not really the same thing. What we kind of go for, if we can, is varroa resistance, which means that that colony has enough individual members who can collectively combine to limit the population size of varroa to a density that doesn't cause mortality. Tolerance is where there's a colony that survives even if the varroa levels get outrageously high. They have adapted to varroa, and they don't care if you've got a sugar shake there, maybe your threshold is 6 mites out of 300 and you get 40. Those colonies can still handle that because they are varroa tolerant. But are there drawbacks to that? Having a whole lot of mites in your colony, even if it doesn't hurt your bees, somebody else's colony that's a half a mile away from you may not have bees that can tolerate varroa that way. So we believe in sharing, but most other beekeepers do not want us to share our mites with them. And even though varroa mites can't fly, they can still migrate to other colonies by way of drones, drifting, robbing, even where foragers hang out at the dinner table. Sometimes varroa mites can jump from bee to bee there or crawl. So You still have the Grim Reaper if you're one of those poor souls who lives near a Varroa tolerant live and let die person who was lucky enough to have their bees survive, even though they said, I don't have time to do anything about Varroa, I don't care. And they have loads of Varroa. That's bringing the Grim Reaper to your apiary and maybe to most of their colonies too. So if you wanted to practice that way, it could be dangerous, especially here in Chatham County, where there are a lot of beekeepers, and it's hard to implement good genetics if you got bad genetics just waiting at the back door. So how do Varroa become resistant? I mean, how do bees become resistant to Varroa? One way is by grooming. If you watch closely enough, you can watch a Varroa mite trying to get this watch a bee trying to get the Varroa mite off of her. They try to do it on themselves if they can, but nest mates often do that for them. This would be in what we have called phoretic phase, where the Varroa mites are out there and exposed, but that terminology is now changing to the dispersal phase. Taxonomists have to make a living too. Why can't they just leave things alone sometimes? Think about the new name for Nosema. I'm not even going there, but that's another taxonomy issue. So those mites that are out there, they're the ones that would get groomed off. And so the Russian bees that we are aware of, ankle biters, mite biters, these are bees that have been bred to go see the Varroa, pounce on it, chew it up, spit it out. I was very excited when I first heard about those. And then a different method of Varroa resistance comes from suppressed mite reproduction, what used to be called SMR. And these are the reproductive phase mites. In other words, they're already in those brood cells on their way to reproducing. The Varroa sensitive hygienics, which is the most commonly known type of bees who suppress the mite reproduction, can smell those Varroa, and they will even tear open the capping and either snatch out the Varroa or snatch out the baby bee who has Varroa on him or her. There may be others who are in that same category that haven't been named yet. So hygienic honeybees are those who quickly remove dead, diseased, and pathogenic items from their household. And that's most often in the brood nest because that's where the diseases almost always are. One example of generally hygienic bees are those who get rid of chalk brood mummies. Chalk brood is a fungus in the brood nest. And the way it affects the larvae and pupae, it makes them into these little grayish white mummies, and they will not survive. If the bees are hygienic enough, they will pull those out and just throw them in what they call their dumpster, which is out the front door. And so bees like Minnesota hygienics, which was the first hygienic bee developed at University of Minnesota back in the 1990s, those are the ones that go after whatever kind of disease and sickness there is. That's a little bit different from the specialists that we know as Varroa sensitive hygienics or VSH. And there is often a difference between the two. Your Minnesota hygienics may not pay much attention to where Varroa mites are. And your Varroa sensitive hygienics may not deal with foul brood or chalk brood. You can't expect that kind of cross coverage. So sometimes you have to decide, do I want this or that? We don't know yet that maybe there's a super bee that can handle all of that. And that would be great. You would have a whole lot of spotty brood patterns because they're pulling out everything. But if the bees that survive end up being healthy, as long as there's still enough left of them to make honey, that's maybe okay. So all of the hygienics that we're aware of, whether the generalists or the Varroa specific ones, have this through their genetics. the biggest problem that seems to have arisen with this whole thing is that it's always found to be a recessive trait, meaning they have to get it from Mama Queen and Papa Drone. And that has driven geneticists and beekeepers crazy because you can't decide who the Papa Drones are going to be unless you do instrumental insemination. And that is very, very tedious and expensive to do. So that has, and one of the articles that I put on the resource list for you is an excellent one that describes why this is so difficult to keep hygienic traits. Even if you can get them to start with, maintaining that is really difficult because at least 51% of the drones that mate with any of the new queens have to have these genetics if you're going to get it noticeably in the offspring. So more specific to Varroa-sensitive hygienics, they're able to sense the presence of Varroa destructor in the brood cell. And one of the mechanisms that's thought to be at play there is this pheromone that is emitted right before the cell is capped. And there are several different ones of those mechanisms that have been found. And so there's the odor from the brood pheromone, and there are other acids in the cells. There's this oleic acid and a few others that contribute to the bees saying, there's something wrong here, we got to get rid of this. There is some thinking that as the bees are uncapping these cells that have Varroa, that releases even more of these acids and these other compounds that get spread around to further encourage getting these pupae out when they have Varroa in there. So they uncap the pupae that contain Varroa. These are the Varroa-sensitive hygienic bees that do this. Most of the time, they remove that pupa from the cell and the Varroa that's on it. Just that act itself will, of course, limit the Varroa reproduction because the Varroa is now out of the cell. And many times, if the bees can get it to the exit, they're pushing it out the door as well. They don't want all that stuff hanging around in the house. Sometimes they will remove the Varroa and recap the cell, and that baby bee is allowed to continue on. We're not sure, I'm not sure, I don't know that anybody's sure how that works, how they can recap some of the cells and not others. I guess it depends on how deeply they have to dig to get the Varroa out of there. So this is another illustration. The bees detect and remove the mite-infested pupa after the mite has started egg laying. That way they know that's a reproductive Varroa mite. Then the mite offspring are killed during the removal, and that interrupts the reproductive cycle of the Varroa mite. So this eliminates that mite and their future generations. But they also ignore or seem to ignore the mites that have no way to reproduce. There must be a chemical involved that the bee says, that one's got nothing. I'm going on to the next cell where I see or I can tell there's already reproduction going on. So the thing I'm trying to point out there is that even VSH bees kind of ignore those Varroa that are not going to reproduce anyway. There's somewhere between 10 and 15% of the female Varroa mites that just are not reproductive for whatever reason. And some of these science nerds have actually cut them open and analyzed all this and found there was no sperm in the spermatheca. They have a spermatheca just like honeybee queens do. So when you're doing the microscopy, Valerie, show us how to do that dissection of a Varroa mite. As I said, Russians are some that groom from themselves and from their nest mates. And then another, and I'm saying these could be technically a form of Varroa-sensitive hygienics. Even though in the true definition that is used, it's more about suppressing reproduction, not getting rid of the ones that are already out there. But again, they're specific to Varroa and they're getting rid of them. So I felt like I should include the Russians who were doing the grooming and the ankle biters. This would have been the varroa mite. The ankle biters just basically chewed off their legs. They can't go anywhere, they can't survive. And then the mite maulers do more than that. They just chew off anywhere and just chew them up, spit them out. And I can't imagine how exciting that was for the folks at Purdue and that group that first found that and saw all those mite parts on the ground, on the bottom board. Yeah, we'd love to see more of that in North Carolina. So how do you know if your bees are hygienic? I mean, people can say, yeah, I'm going to sell you this hygienic bee. That's going to be the best queen ever. And by the way, it's not $40, it's 80 or 100, because that's a special queen you're getting. So how do you know that they have really tested that? Or have they? With the generalist bees and Minnesota hygienics and those that are good for sickness and whatever, then you can use some of these assays, freezer killed brood assay, or the liquid nitrogen killed assay. And those were the standards until pretty recently. They're still often used. With the freezer, it's got to be at least 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. 32 degrees to 0 degrees isn't enough. 10 below for 24 to 48 hours. And you would take out a section that's got about 100 capped cells on each side. A lot of times when you see that illustrated, you'll see it in a rectangle or a square. If it's going to be the freeze killed or liquid nitrogen killed, then you use liquid nitrogen, about 300 mLs in a 3-inch diameter tube. So you'll see that rounded area where liquid nitrogen was applied, killed all the bees, the babies. And then in a 24-hour period, you identify about what percentage of these babies that were dead in that circle are pulled out. So if at least 95% of those babies are removed in that 24-hour period, then you can say, yes, those are hygienic bees. This picture, I don't know how many of you can see it, but here they got virtually 100% of it. Here, not quite so much, maybe 80 to 90. And here, that's awful result. I mean, I don't think anybody would want those bees that can't clean up any better than that small circle. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. A square. Yep. Yeah, let me illustrate better because I forgot to mention a step. Thank you for pointing that out. After you cut that out and put it in that very, 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 very cold freezer, 24, 48 hours, I would say mark the hive and the frame and then put it back in there. And then 24 hours later, I don't know that you should give them 48 hours. Maybe they're thinking about whatever time it would take for that to thaw before the bees can start pulling on it. So it's in that section, and they should pull out 95% of what's now dead in there. And it's going to be on both sides. I'm sorry? Because they're dead. For any reason. These are dead because they got frozen to death. If it was American foul brood disease, you would sure want them getting that sickness out, or European foul brood, or even some of the viral sicknesses that I was talking about, which don't necessarily have varroa in the cells where the viruses are. So the generalists, even though it was varroa that maybe caused that parasitic mite syndrome with the sick larvae, the generalists still recognize this is wrong, it's sick, I'm getting it out. They may not go to the cells where the varroa are. Uh-huh. Is there, yeah.
So you're cutting out that square tree.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Thank you, Mimi. She pointed out a good thing. If you have plastic foundation, this will be exceedingly difficult. I'm sorry, I didn't think of that, but you're exactly right, and I'm glad you brought that up. So it's going to be really hard. However, you're still going to kill them on your way getting them out. So it might be worth giving it a try anyway.
But the liquid nitrogen method,
It is, if you can find liquid nitrogen and use it safely. Well, Marla Spivak and Gary Reuter at University of Minnesota developed this, and they went through various trials. They said that. I didn't ask them why. That's a good question. You would think if it's just down to 20 degrees or 8, isn't that still going to kill them? Not sort of dead, really, really dead. So I don't know unless they just wanted it to be absolutely sure. Yeah, they wanted fast death. Yeah. So that can be your research project.
Yeah.
Take a little hint with that. I know the idea was that could make the idea of putting a pin in thoroughly debunked.
Not thoroughly debunked. You could do that. You just have to stab hard enough to kill the bee and not just open the capping, because they might just recap it, fix the capping. But so you could do that, but this is a more uniform way, because if you just did, then you're going to have to keep track of, well, how many was that? And it just seems like it'll be a little more complicated. Any other questions? Don't know that I can really click on any links and have them come up, but this is from University of Georgia, even though the original document came through University of Minnesota. There, see, Mike's good for more than his journeyman skills. Thank you for your tech help. This is a wonderful one-page thing that it's on the University of Georgia website, but I'm expecting it's probably on University of Minnesota website as well. This is an instructional poster made by Gary Reuter and Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota. And it goes through step by step how to do the freeze kill method. And it says, freeze the section of brood in the freezer at least 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit for 24, 48 hours. And so then that's the first 5 of how to do the freeze killed brood method. And then the liquid nitrogen killed brood is 6 through 10 through 9. And then it goes further how to evaluate both results. So it gives you all the steps how to do it and shows results, great pictures, all that kind of stuff. And it mentions here in the last item the fact that hygienic behavior is recessive. Just reminding us of that sad piece of information that makes it so difficult for us to continue the genetic lines of hygienic bees. So that was for the generalists. Now it's a little more complicated, or it can be, for the Varroa sensitive hygienics. Maybe the uncapping behavior that we see. Some of you may not be able to see this clearly enough, but there are quite a few capped cells that have started to become uncapped. And especially when you see almost the whole head of the baby bee and you can see the eyes or the color of the eyes, that's not because they're still capping it. They have been uncapping that one with some kind of plan, probably to take it out or to get rid of something that doesn't seem right. And so in my experience, when I see that uncapping behavior, I'm thinking, well, this is probably Varroa sensitive. And many times it seems to be, because when I check mite counts, they're pretty low. Sometimes they're pretty high. And it makes me think they've been working so hard to get rid of mites, but they just don't have enough power to do all of that. We tend to use mite counts to see how our bees are. Are they handling mites well or not? And I use that, and I will continue to use that to determine which kind of the colonies I have are doing well against Varroa and which are struggling. Because the ones that are struggling, I don't like those genetics, and I want to do something about that. The uncapping behavior and the mite counts are useful for evaluation in general, but they don't have all of the clear factors that we could say, yes, that's specific to Varroa-sensitive hygienics. Sometimes there are other things that cause the mite levels to be lower. So that's where you get into the Harbaugh method. Dr. John Harbaugh was at the USDA lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and one of their specialties is genetics. And he probably had a lot to do with that. He's partnered up a lot with Dr. Jeff Harris at Mississippi, and they've done a lot of this Varroa-sensitive hygienic stuff together. He's got a really nice article it's about 22 pages, but it's so much in detail and with lots of pictures how to do the Harbaugh method of mite evaluation. Similar to how the alcohol wash is going to be your the gold standard for accuracy on your mite counts, the Harbaugh method is going to be the gold standard for evaluating Varroa-sensitive hygienics. It's not that easy to do, but with some practice, you can do that. And what he suggests is you have to wait at least 7 weeks after your new queen starts laying eggs, because you need a few generations of these worker bees to really determine how well they are working against Varroa. What I find interesting is that they always talk about they use worker brood for this test, even though we think, and the evidence suggests, that Varroa are more into the drone cells. So I've tried to find, and I haven't found it yet, but I haven't had a lot of time to look. Why do they use workers instead of drone cells? Wouldn't it make more sense to those of us who feel like a lot of the drones are, dispensable? So why couldn't they have some formula that says X amount of mites per drone cell then constitutes? Maybe because they didn't want to do a whole lot of math. For them, it's either 0 or 1 Varroa mite in the cell of a worker bee. You have to use worker brood to do this. You uncap about 100 of them. They have to be capped for at least 7 days because you want the mites to have a chance to start reproducing. If you uncapped this a day or two after that Varroa mite went in there, she may not have laid any eggs yet, even though she's fertile. So after it's capped for 7 days, the Varroa mite who's pregnant has already started laying eggs. So you know she's reproductive. If you go beyond 11 days of it capped, and worker bees are usually capped for about 12 days, then it's a little bit more difficult to identify the Varroa and all that kind of stuff because the picture is a little bit skewed. If you were to look at Dr. Harbaugh's paper that's on that resource list, you'll see, because he's got pictures of all that. You don't want a whole lot of larvae on that frame either that you're going to be testing because it takes a while, depending on, maybe you can get the frame out of the hive today, but you can't uncap. You got something else you got to do. So you're going to keep that frame indoors or something. The larvae aren't going to survive very well. So try to make it where there's not that many larvae. Interestingly enough, it's okay if there are eggs on there, according to Dr. Harbaugh. So you want to have a very good light, some kind of magnification, and he gives some discussion about different kinds of smartphones that he uses to get good light and magnification to see inside those cells. You uncap the cell, you pull out the worker, you examine the worker for mites, and then look in the cell wall and see if there are in the cell and see if there are Varroa in there. Sometimes we identify the varroa by the fecal matter, little white spots that are in there on the cell wall. He has specifically said that if you don't see fecal matter, or if you see fecal matter, but it's on the baby bee instead of the cell wall, then it's probably not a reproductive mite. Who'd have thought? But he's tested it enough to know. He and Dr. Harris must have had a whole lot of time or money to do all this kind of stuff. So this picture is actually one from Dr. Robin Underwood from Penn State University. She spoke at our spring meeting in 2020. What a great speaker. Just all kinds of great information. And so she has even identified these various parts that constitute a varroa-infested cell. She shows the mite feces, the varroa mite egg, immature varroa, and all these kind of things. So that picture is in one of the resources that were on your list there. So, as I said, the non-reproductive mites have neither cell wall fecal matter nor any offspring in the cell at this 7 to 11 days post-capping. He says that with practice, you can look at 100 pupae and cells in about 15 minutes. That's a lot of practice, I would think. Finding 5 or more reproductive mites cells out of 100 means that is not a VSH genetics. So when you buy these queens that are said to be VSH, consider the idea of doing this. Now, it's going to take you a long time to get those results. But I don't like people selling me something that's not really what they said it was. And there's a lot of that happens with honeybees. If you say, let's say you get 4 out of that 100 and you think, hey, well, it's suggested you do another 100. That wasn't enough to start with. But again, with practice, you could do all of that 200 in maybe 30 minutes or less with practice. And these 2 links just show, this is the one from Penn State, great pictures. It's only like 5 or 6 pages. Really good explanations and nice pictures. And then Harbo Bee Company has all this, how to measure VSH, on their website. Any questions about that Harbo method? Yes, ma'am. Queens. That's what I would ask them. They might say, oh, I bought this breeder queen. Man, was she ever fabulous. All of her offspring, they met all the Harbo method, everything. And yeah, okay, I paid $600 for her, but wow, she's a good queen. So I've raised all these 60 queens over the last 6 weeks off of her. And you're a lucky person that's getting one of those 60 queens. What you don't know is who these new queens mated with. So you might get a varroa dilution. Mm-hmm.
Because they have been.
That would be ideal. I would suggest that very few actually do that. Isn't that what the Chatham micro breeders are doing? That would be ideal. It's still challenging. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try because of these obstacles I've mentioned. I'm just trying to make it real and give you the absolute truth. But it also gives you reason to perhaps question people who say, I can sell you this VSH queen. Ask the same questions you have asked. How do you know that that's a VSH queen? And just challenge them. Did you do the Harbo method? And they might look at you like, what? Mm-hmm.
Dr. Tartley is talking about how lots of the drones are shooting blanks these days anyway. And I don't know they've figured out if it's, you know, chemicals or whatever in the air, whatever. But the other thing is, everybody always wants their piece. If you wait longer, and it's a reputable, you're gonna make sure that that queen laying very well. They might not check in points, but at least they're making sure that anybody that gets a package in March, order your new. Because they're gonna be worthless. And that's the truth.
Okay, Valerie. Oh, wait, before you say, I've been informed in the past that people on Zoom, are there folks joining us on Zoom? Oh, don't worry about it. Because sometimes they can't hear the questions. Did you hear what Pat was talking about? Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. Maybe if there's that much mite pressure, you're probably going to know. And that same concept, I don't really have the UBO, unpleasant brood odor, which you had Phoebe Snyder here, I think as recently as last year. I remember coming here to listen to her speak here. But she was one of those who helped develop this. This is a type of odor that smells like a varroa stressed baby bee. And it gets the workers to uncap those, or if they are varroa sensitive hygienic, they will uncap a certain percentage of the cells where the UBO is applied. That's how you can test your mites. But it was later discovered that that didn't work so well after the spring, and it might be for the same reason that you're talking about. But with the VSH, they're that way all the time. In other words, they're just as good as sniffing out and limiting reproduction in the fall as they are in the spring. But you're right, Valerie, if there is so much mite pressure that they just can't get all that done. So the question that I would ask related to that, how could there have been that much mite pressure for them to do so well and be clearly VSH true, but not here? How did all those mites get in there without them doing something about it? So I just would love for somebody to come up with the equivalent type of test on drone cells. And it's not that I hate drones. We just don't need them as bad as we do workers. So that's something still for evaluation. And that I haven't seen because I haven't had time to read very thoroughly all of the literature to know, does that always play out with the Harbor method as well? Thanks for bringing that up. Are there other? Okay. So some of what I've talked about, you can probably already surmise. The advantages of the VSH focused IPM is you don't have to deal necessarily. You may not have to deal with chemicals, the time, the expense, and the risk. All chemicals have risks. Some of the miticides will make the queen back off on her egg laying or just shut her down for a while. There's a better chance of long-term success because once your bees have these genetics, if you can do what it takes to keep them going, then that's going to continue on. It's not like they're likely to suddenly change their genetics midstream. And if you just think regular beekeeping is just too easy, I got other things to say to you, but then okay, challenge yourself with the VSH stuff. Obvious disadvantage is it does take time and effort, but once you sort of get into it and learn it and practice it, I just can't help but think that in the long run, you're going to be ahead of the people who are going to be running into the bottleneck where the chemical treatments are not as effective as they were. Remember this disadvantage that the BSH trait is a recessive gene. We have nothing that says it isn't so far. So to summarize the IPM for Varroa, identify the pest in the threshold, monitor the pest, determine your plan, then act, assess your results. There's the pyramid, cultural as your foundation, resistant stock, brood breaks, add mechanical, maybe chemical, drone cell comb, screen bottom boards, maybe. Oxalic acid would be one chemical that can be used in combination with this. And I don't know if we have time for me to do a few case study examples. Okay. So I'm going to give you some examples. And these are situations that really could happen in apiaries to review some of IPM. Samuel has 4 honeybee colonies and he's got 6 years of beekeeping experience. He works from home, got a flexible schedule. He has 2 school-aged children. His wife isn't really into bees, but she sometimes helps him out with it. So on the 4th of March, he checked Varroa levels with the sugar shake. He got 3 Varroa out of 300 bees. That was the average for his 4 colonies. Does he have to do anything right now about that? That's within reason. There would be no need to do any chemical related stuff. But he decides, I've heard about IPM and I've been told you got to start early, so here I go. He placed 2 of these drone cell frames that were drawn comb into the brood nest of each of his 4 colonies on that same day that he did that test. Because he decided, I don't have to intervene, but I want to do some more preventive cultural methods to limit the Varroa overload. So those are the frames that he put in there. Now remember, you have to get those out before the drones emerge. Otherwise, you've really made a mess. You've got lots of drones that maybe you didn't want, lots of mites that you almost certainly didn't want. So he was in tune with that, and he took them out on the 20th, which would not have given them enough time to emerge, even if the queen bee went that evening and started laying eggs in there. Remember, you have to put them close enough to the brood nest where the queen's going to get to them. If you put them way on the side of the box, that's not going to really help your IPM. And he put those into the freezer. Then on the 4th, a month later, he split 2 colonies and he allowed them to requeen themselves. So they had a brood break. The other 2 colonies swarmed. They made their own brood break. So he's got brood breaks in all 4 of his colonies now. He did a sugar shake test about 6 weeks later, and he got 1 Varroa out of 300 bees. Is he done for the season with Varroa management? Did he just say, all righty then? I see a lot of no, almost no way. So on the 26th, he got that result. He added 2 drone cell frames to the brood nest in each of, now he has 6 colonies. So he added those to each of them. But it rained and it rained. And the kids are out of school in June. Oh, we want to take a vacation. Okay. So he didn't get back to this until the 22nd of June. That's right. Uh-oh. So Samuel was trying so hard. That's one example. I've got maybe 2 more case studies here. Each of them have examples of real life interfering with bees. And it will make you crazy in the spring. Even if you've got some experience and you know what to do and you can do it sort of quickly. But what about that concert you wanted to go to? What about the soccer game your kids had? What about this deal at work where you got to be on call extra? Somebody calls you in. This is real life stuff. What if your spouse says, you know, them bees are getting more attention than I am? I mean, all that stuff can happen. A lot of people I know work through the week and they decide the weekend is my beekeeping time. But we know, seems like almost every weekend has a rainy day in it. So you can go and open a colony on a rainy day, but I don't need that kind of apitherapy myself. Okay, Samuel, he does a sugar shake on that day. All of the colonies have 12 or more varroa per 300. Even though they had brood breaks, he introduced a whole lot more varroa potential with the drone cells that he didn't get out. But he doesn't see any evidence of disease. And can he wait on that varroa level? But he's got honey to take off, and he doesn't want to contaminate that. There's options or what he can do. He decided, I'm getting the honey off, whatever's ready now, and I'm not waiting because I got to get rid of those varroa. Now, you could keep the honey on there and put your Apiguard, but that honey is not going to be fit to bottle or sell. So if it's me, I'm taking it off so I don't contaminate the wax in that honey. So he used Apiguard because in June it can get pretty hot. And that is one option that we can use for really hot weather is Apiguard, thymol. The temps were 90 degrees though, so he put the half dose, 25 grams per hive, and he used 3 doses. It's supposed to be a total of 100 grams. So if you use 25 grams at a time, you got to put in 4 doses. Well, he got kind of mixed up. There was a lot going on. He forgot. The kids were out of class. They wanted this, they wanted that. And he works from home. So the kids are, hey, Dad, what's it? So he just didn't get that 4th dose on there. He rechecked the levels again on August the 2nd, which would have been about 6 weeks or so. And he had 8 varroa out of 300. That's a little bit less than 3%. During that time, you can go up to 3%. And if there's not sickness, it will probably be okay if the varroa level doesn't get any higher. When, remember your question and I'll come back to it. That's the next one is Carla, so I'm ready.
I don't know, I was just wondering.
The question is there an option for cultural and mechanical or something non-chemical when you have, what was it, 12? 12 that inspired the Apiguard. Yeah. And that was the average, 12 or more in each colony. So we had to do something. And your question is, instead of Apiguard at that time, could he have done something else? At that time, when it's hot like that, he could have used Apivar. He would not have gotten good results from formic acid because it's usually too hot in June. You're going to fry your bees and everybody. You wouldn't use oxalic acid unless it was the long acting that just was available last year, because oxalic acid doesn't penetrate the brood cappings. But he could have put the Varoxan, the long-acting oxalic, onto there. So his options were limited, partly because of the temperature and partly because of efficacy or not when there's plenty of brood in the colony. This is Carla. She really loved the 1970s. She's had bees for about 2 years. She has 2 colonies. She wants all natural bees. So her first year, she did everything natural and the bees naturally died. So she works full time. She has 3 children between the ages of 6 and 17. Do you want to tell her anything yet about beekeeping? Like, don't do it? Her husband travels in his work. He's home most weekends and he's willing to help with the bees. So he's there some. She bought 2 nukes on the 29th of March and both the colonies swarmed about 5 weeks later. So she's got a brood break. a mentor came along and said, hey, I can help you. And 4 days after the swarm, suggested they do oxalic acid vapor. What might be wrong with that plan? 4 days after the colony has swarmed. Still plenty of capped brood, and that vapor's not getting through those cells. Oxalic acid is a good idea after a swarm, but not that soon after. There's so much of all this stuff that uses the life cycle of honeybees. And if you don't almost memorize the life cycle of honeybees, a lot of management, especially with Varroa, is going to be very difficult and may not be successful. So Carla found a hive that she felt like was queenless on the 15th. And that's what they look like. Is it possible that they were not truly queenless? What's the possibility, Janice? She didn't find eggs or larvae. I forgot to mention that. So that's why she thought, well, I don't see a queen, I don't see eggs, and I don't see larvae. Right. That's very possible. When you see that your brood nest is backfilled with nectar, it's May. There's still pretty heavy nectar flow in our area in May. So if there's no queen filling up those slots with brood, they're going to fill it with nectar because they got to put it somewhere. So what's going to happen if she goes and says, well, I ain't got no queen, I better go get one. And she goes and gets a queen and introduces it there. What'll happen? Yeah, she's just wasted a good queen. But a lot of people do that. So what I wanted to say there is your landmark is going to be when you have no more capped brood at all, not even a single drone cell. And you know the colony swarmed and you still have nobody laying, you probably don't have a queen. She probably got eaten on a mating flight or something like that. The only exception there is if there was then a secondary swarm, like a week or 10 days after the initial one, because you still had too many queen cells in there. And maybe the first swarm took a pretty good amount, but not all of them that wanted to go went. They said, oh, we missed the train. So here's another opportunity. Boom, that new queen goes off on a mating flight. They think, all right, that's what I've been waiting for. And they go with her in a swarm. So before you decide after a swarm that you have no queen, wait and give her some time. She did on the 28th a sugar shake test. She got 2 Varroa out of 300 bees. And her mentor had advised her, hey, that's pretty good. So she figured, hey, I'm done with Varroa. Mentor says, no, you're not. The mentor didn't know till August because he's kind of, well, call me when you need me. And she didn't know. So they got 33 Varroa out of 300 bees. Does she need to do something? What option might she have in August for a natural approach? Because she doesn't want to put any of the hard chemicals. It's enough for her to even put any kind of chemical. But she learned the hard way herself and through some of her other friends that bees sometimes can't handle all the Varroa mess without help. So in August, what options does she have for what might be considered natural? She could, but there's already too many Varroa. She has to do something that's going to work now. She could trap the queen for the further reproduction of Varroa, but it's already been clear that there's so many that if she doesn't do something that's going to start killing Varroa soon, then her colony will die because it's August. The queen isn't laying as many eggs as she was in May and June. So you've already got that working against them. Now, if it were April or May, that would be a really good option. So she went to the Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa decision-making tool and decided, you know what, ApiGuard looks like a good plan. And so that's what she used. And the temperatures were not so hot that she could use the full 50-gram dose each time. And she got both doses in there. She finished that on the 18th of September. And then 10 days later, checked the mite count, and she got 8 Varroa, 300 bees. You might still be able to go 2 to 3% in that time, but you're getting close to where you need to get it down to 2. However, she also saw this. So now what? She has to do something now, because this is already there. And if it's September, it may be that she's already too late. It could be that no matter what she does from this point on, the colony will still die, because this is so deadly, this parasitic mite viral disease. What ended up happening, because she said, well, it's below the threshold, and her mentor said, no, but they're sick. And she said, oh, I don't want to put any chemicals in there. We already put one in, and that's all I'm allowing. So because of this, the population got smaller and smaller and smaller, because so many weren't making it. Queen's already down, low on her egg laying rate. So this was the outcome. The population got so small, they couldn't form enough of a winter cluster to survive the cold. So when somebody says to you, yeah, that colony didn't make it through the winter, they froze to death, that's like saying the wax moth killed them. It's always secondary if either wax moths take them out or they freeze to death. Something enabled the population to get too low to survive the cold. Here's Bob. There's a beekeeper Bob in every group. There's not any Bob in here today. Okay. Bob has 3 years of beekeeping. He's into his bees. He's got 4 colonies. He's retired. But I'm going to tell you what, retirement doesn't mean you have a lot of extra time. Makes me sad. But he's active in his church and his community. Bob likes to stay busy, takes a walk every other day and that kind of stuff. He bought 2 queens that were told to him these were VSH queens. And he bought them in April. He made splits from his 4 colonies so he'd have a place to put the VSH queens. And he used drone cell frames in the brood nest of the other 4 colonies that he had on the 18th. And he took out those drone cell frames on the 5th of May. It doesn't say here whether it was already drawn comb or not, but I'm just going to say he took them out in time. We'll put it that way. He did a sugar shake Varroa test on the 28th of May, and the average was 4 Varroa for 300 bees. Late May, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to do any extra intervention then. Is he done for the season? So Bob says, well, I want to get that honey off, and he had enough by late June. He was ready to take it off. Did that. Early July, checked a sugar shake, 5 Varroa out of 300 bees, still less than 2%. He's still okay. He put 2 more drone cell frames in there, but not the ones that were VSH, because he thought, I'm low on these number of frames now, and these are VSH. They should be able to handle stuff without me doing all that extra. So he took them out on the 19th of colonies he put it. And then on the 10th of August, he checked the VSH colonies, and he got 16 Varroa out of 300 bees. What do you think happened? They probably were not really VSH, because he checked earlier, the VSH levels were okay. So it wasn't that they were duds from the beginning. And it's not likely they got so overwhelmed, even though they might have really been VSH. No, that they were probably a VSH hybrid. And if you've ever planted the seeds of a hybrid tomato, you may not have gotten anything close to what the previous fruit was. So it works similarly with honeybees. I think this might be the last one because I know time's getting late. Annie has 2 years of beekeeping, 3 colonies, and 2 of them overwintered. 2 of them swarmed on the 26th of March. And this was supposed to have a queen in the clip. She didn't put the colony in a clip. She put the queen in a clip because she thought, okay, I'm gonna have a brood break here, but I can't handle queens well enough to stuff her in a cage. I'm just gonna take that hair clip looking thing and put her in there. And you can do that, but you have to make room for it. I would say if you do that, and this is the end that closes together, and you're gonna leave it in there for a day or more, tape it. Because if the bees want her out bad enough, they will open that thing. I don't know how they do it because there's supposed to be a pretty strong spring, but they want her out bad enough, they're going to get her out. So if you do this method, put tape or something over there that they can't open it up. So remember, 18 days, that queen is not laying eggs. And we're thinking about life cycle of bees and the life cycle of the mites and how they have to have brood to reproduce. She had a beekeeping friend come over to give oxalic acid on the 22nd of April. So that's 3.5 weeks after those swarmed. Now that timing would be about right. Because after a swarm, it's about 2 weeks before your new queen has been mated and is laying eggs. So anytime in that first 8 or 9 days of her egg laying, you can successfully administer oxalic acid because nothing's capped yet. So that timing would have worked on the oxalic acid. She put 2 drone cell frames into each colony on the 14th of May. It wasn't yet drawn comb, so she had to wait a while for it to get drawn out, queens to lay in there and all that. So on the 17th of June, she took those out. On the 30th, she did a sugar shake. The average was 2 mites per 300 bees. So Annie's doing pretty good. And she's in her 2nd year, but she's really into this and wanting to know how to minimize the mites without having to do chemicals. So on the 25th of July, she did another sugar shake. It was fine. On the 27th of August, she did another one, and that was fine. But then on the 22nd of September, then she's over 3% on her threshold. And according to the Honeybee Health Coalition, nothing over 3% is acceptable any time of year for your varroa levels. So she administered formic acid. And there's a lot of times in that part of the year that you can do formic acid safely. There are times in September that you can't because it's so hot. So you've got to look at your weather forecast for a lot of things with bees, including mite treatments. If you're going to use formic acid in the fall, you really should look out 1 week into it. First 3 days are the most potent. So if you're looking at the forecast and you see, gee, 8 days from now, it's going to be 90 degrees, probably still okay to use your formic acid because the most potent part of it is going to be over by the time that 90 degrees hits, especially if your decision is either that or your bees die. So integrated pest management for varroa can be challenging, but it's not impossible if you plan, and you got to count out stuff and, you know, figure out the specifics of it. Genetics, I would say, is still promising long term. The thing is that, and some of us have talked about this for years, Lori, if half of Chatham County could have all these varroa sensitive hygienics, then we don't have to worry about the skanks that are just so sorry with dealing with varroa. So everybody's queens is mating with the good drones and it's all great. That is where everybody has to buy in, or 90% of the people. And you can't tell people what to do and how to raise their bees and all that. So it's difficult when the genetics are recessive. A lot of people apply miticides according to the calendar. Okay, it's March, I'm going to put this in there, and it's June, I'm going to put that in. It's not really about the mite levels. If you're a commercial beekeeper with 1,000 colonies, you kind of have to do it that way. But us small scale people, if anybody's going to get ahead of varroa without the chemicals, it's going to be the small scale people. I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying don't use chemicals. I'm saying it should not be your first resort, unless if you finally got to checking and you got a very high mite level, you're probably going to have to use chemicals at that time. So if our practices as beekeepers as a whole don't change, then we're going to have a bottleneck of safe and effective chemicals. I don't know what's caused those heavy losses in 2023 and 24. I don't think all the studies have been shown, all the analyzing, and if it's government to do the analyzing, we may not know until 2026. But I don't know if it's because commercial beekeepers were hit hard with those losses. I don't know if it has anything to do with their varroa management or not. So let's use our tools and our knowledge for smarter, not harder beekeeping. So use your available resources like the management tools and all the stuff that we do have available to us. Start early before May for best results if you want to really incorporate successful IPM. If you're working on genetics, keep working on it. Flood those areas with good quality drones so that your new queens have good options for mating. And we have to start somewhere, even if it's small. If we give up and we just say, well, it's just so much easier to put some of that apivar in there, that's up to you. But it doesn't help the rest of us for long-term results because we already know that there's some resistance to apivar. There may be other miticides that are going to develop resistance as well if we don't rotate and use them more cautiously.